hours. And that's the apparent one.
Really?
We'll just start right now. Yeah.
Oh, that's a limit.
I just saw when I hit start, I was like, you can broadcast for up to 8 hours. Whoop. There we go.
Make sure I get this right.
And we're from Grand Rapids. We're gonna hit the IKEA tomorrow or Saturday.
There's no IKEA on your side?
No, you guys got the only ones. And even that one's not that old, right? It's like, what, 10 years old, maybe?
Not even.
Not even.
Not even, yeah.
Probably like 6 or something.
My mom used to live in Canton, like 2 miles from there. So I remember when I went in. Wasn't, yeah. Hey, right? It wasn't even 10 years ago. That's me. And we might hit the DIA tomorrow. So come to Detroit very often.
Yeah.
If you go to Henry Ford on Groupon, they have a discount ticket.
For Henry Ford?
Yeah.
Oh, really? That's a good tip. Mm-hmm. I want to go back. Not right now because it's winter, but Greenfield Village too. That was like our destination of choice for field trips when we were kids. It's like just far enough away. It was like a really big deal.
Just post.
What are we supposed to be logging into? Because that password isn't working on it. What?
Also, there's a guest network. Make sure you're getting the guest. At least guest.
Okay.
Respace.
Thank- Oh, I tried that.
In all capitals, yeah.
All
right,
Post this here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Taking over here for a second. All right. Cool. I think we'll get started, and if anyone else comes in, we'll just welcome them in. I think we have enough seats. Thank you, Reese, for is it Riss or Reese?
Reese.
Reese for sponsoring basically the location, the food, and kind of being a great supporter of the Laravel meetup. We do have one other sponsor, but they just kind of signed on today. TEK Systems, which is an IT staffing agency, they're going to be supporting us on the our meetup.com costs, so that way we can continue to stay free and not have to, a couple other meetups that I've organized and stuff like that, we haven't had a meetup.com sponsor because it costs, some money to keep on Meetup. So we'd had to charge $5 per meetup, and that's really annoying. And so TEK Systems, I don't have a pitch for them yet or anything, but they're an IT staffing agency. So anyone looking for either contract work or contract workers, they're great at connecting those two groups.
That'll be my first big boy job.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like that's a special company.
Yeah. So, yeah.
They're out of Grand Rapids, right? Or out of
Yeah.
Locations
I don't know where
everywhere.
they're
Okay.
at originally. They're
National
everywhere.
Tennessee.
I got that job in
Okay.
Nashville, yeah.
Okay. So basically, I don't know if we want to go around. We have more people than normal, and kind of just introduce yourself and kind of what you do with Laravel or what you do in your day job, and then we also kind of, if you have any job opportunities at your place of employment or any openings, this is a great time to announce those. Or if you're looking for work, this is another great time to announce those. I know my name is Nick Denardis. I work at Wayne State University Education. Not hiring, but I do know that U of M Dearborn is looking for a Drupal developer to work in their external relations department, which is basically most of their public-facing websites. And then there is, I don't know too much about it, but there's a Techtown-based startup that's looking for a lead developer with full-stack Laravel experience. And they need to find somebody in the short term, but they're looking to hire them full-time, once funding is obtained. And so I don't have a ton of information on that other than a contact person. So if anybody is looking for a role like that, that's that.
I can say. My name's Rob Vrabel. I actually work with Nick at Wayne State, and basically like a full stack web developer. So.
My name is Andrew Coper. I work at Ford. I'm a developer at Ford, and I like open source.
My name's Mari Conrads, and I'm actually a graphic designer, but I went to one other meetup on Laravel, and I'm here to learn more.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Justin Coven, and I work with IT Maturity. We have a web application, Topic Hero, allows you to organize all of your links, RSS feeds, search engines, notes, even you can create web pages, and the chat all organized around topics. And you can share those topics with other people. So you can basically, it's an easy way for sharing your links and news feeds and that type of thing. I have flyers if you're interested.
My name is Goran Butorac. I work with a couple of guys who are here at North American Bankcard, full stack developer. Haven't tried Laravel ever. I work mostly in Symfony. Looking forward to finding out.
I work at North American Bankcard too. So this is my first meetup here, so first time here. So looking forward.
Phil Packard, also working up there, full stack developer, one of the team leads. We are actively looking for developers. So,
Cool. My name's TJ. I'm a full stack, Laravel, WordPress, Craft, all sorts of everything, system administration. Work at Laravel, and I do like that software and everything too. So,
My name is Shannon. I work with Phil and Niraj and Goran over at North American Bankcard. I'm a developer there as well. I actually have used Laravel for a couple of projects, including one pretty massive one that I probably wrote about 40,000 lines for. So I'm into it. I like Laravel quite a lot. So I'm stoked about this.
I'm Godfrey Nolan. I'm the owner here at Reese, so apologies for the long construction stuff. The only developing I do, I guess, is Android from time to time. So I'm more of a Java guy, but we're always looking for PHP guys, so anybody's interested in that. So.
Josh Conger. I'm an independent web consultant and I'm a full stack developer, and I use Laravel on my client.
Awesome. Cool. So, I'm not going to do too much of an introduction.
Can I jump in?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry, I totally forgot. I know you were going to announce something.
That's right. I got a call 20 minutes ago from Jill Roston. He is at TechTown, the kind of technology business incubator in Detroit. There's a startup there that is looking for a lead developer, lead Laravel developer. The startup is, he asked me to announce this job opening, pro-up.co. It's a site that will connect high school students with internships and professional job opportunities to help them, I guess, grow, develop, get accepted into college and stuff like that. So they are looking to kind of get funded, but they need a Laravel developer to join, to be on their team if they get funded to develop the application and try to build pieces together. So contact Jill Roston at TechTown if that's something you want to pursue.
Cool. And Godfrey, the bathrooms are right out here, right?
Yep.
And you don't need to code anymore, or at the moment?
No.
Okay. So, just in case anybody is looking for that. And with that, I'll let Ryan take it over.
Awesome. By the way, was this you doing like the Laravel?
One of our graphic designers.
Yeah, it's pretty rad.
Yeah, right.
Leanna said, she's like, it's awesome, and I was like, that is awesome. So I'm from close enough to Detroit that like I'm a fan of like every Detroit sport. So like every sport that there is, like Red Wings, like that's my team. So I definitely resonate with the Detroit up there. So thanks for having me, guys. Actually, really interesting group with the mix. So I think this is actually going to be really fun. People come from Laravel perspective, people come from Symfony perspective, totally other different perspectives. Sound like you did just about everything back there with TJ, right? Yeah. So it's funny, you do like everything, but not necessarily everything on this list. So you're just like, hey, I do like everything, but I want like a couple more things that I can do. Just pile it on. Sounds good. So I'm actually from Grand Rapids. So I'm born and raised in Michigan, far from here. Live in Grand Rapids right now. I'm from the Symfony world, so just give you like that background, so you know like where, like what kind of angle I'm talking from. I'm the lead for the Symfony documentation, and also a Symfony core contributor. So I'm like quite heavily involved in the Symfony world. Also a writer for campuniversity.com tutorials, which is kind of like Symfony's Laracast. Laracast also does things outside of Laravel. We also do things outside of Symfony as well. But I figure we're in a Laravel meetup, so probably a lot of people are familiar with Laracast. So we're kind of similar to them. So it's good to have one of our videos. And we also have coding challenge, which is something that Laracast doesn't have that we do. We're doing a lot more with that kind of stuff. So it's something that really pushed a lot. I do a lot of in-person training, so it's like kind of our way of how do we get the in-person training feel, which I really like to do on the web. Is in approximated as much as possible. And of course, we all know like practicing is important. So even videos are like, I'm showing you how to do this, but you better be coding along with me. Don't be lazy.
You look a lot like old man science.
That's great. That's a great compliment. I've also gotten, maybe my hair's a little bit long right now, but what's the guy, what is that one? What's the show even? Doctor Who, yeah. Yeah. What, I don't remember his name. But yeah, the Dr. guy, because there's been multiple, but one of the more recent ones. And most importantly, I'm the husband of that lady over there, Leanna, my wife. She's awesome. She likes high fives. She likes to talk about programming. She likes to talk about HTML and CSS and that kind of stuff. And you can talk to her about back-end programming stuff, and she's been around for long enough that she actually knows what you're talking about. She'll just, sometimes I forget she can't write the code.
At least get your bad jokes.
Yes, but she might like not put a semicolon at the end of the line if you like make her type it. Okay. So what's Symfony? There's like one slide for this because probably most of you guys know anyway. So it's two things. It's a framework, which Laravel is a framework. So familiar with Laravel, that's the first thing it is. And the second thing is it's a set of components, which is really like what brings me to a Laravel meetup where I would otherwise 5 years ago had no business being even qualified to talk about in any way, shape, or form. So it's a set of like 40-ish small, reasonably decoupled PHP libraries, small tools. I need to do X, so I bring in this tool. And hopefully most of you are familiar with Composer and just that idea, you know, PHP of just being able to bring in small little packages. So Symfony is almost like a brand name around a bunch of them. They all go through the same release cycle process. They're all of kind of the same quality. And obviously there are more independent libraries that exist around the world outside of Symfony and outside of Laravel. And where is, there it is. Boom, there's Laravel right there. So you can actually go to symfony.com/projects and see like this giant list of open source projects that have Symfony under the hood. And obviously the other one that we're going to talk about a little bit today is this guy right here, the Drupal bubble, which is like one of the biggest and most important projects that uses Symfony under the hood. But actually Composer does as well. So I love Symfony. I've worked with Symfony for like 10 years. How many of you have heard like the simple versus easy kind of thing before? Okay, good. So this is something that somebody told me. So the definition of simple is something that consists of sort of a few parts. Like you can sort of like open something up and it might be intricate, but you're like, yeah, this does that, this does this does this. Like I got it. I can open this up and it's clear to me how it works. And easy means close at hand. So it's like the easy button, like boom, you hit it and it just works. So easy is not necessarily simple. Simple is not necessarily easy, because even if I lay out all the parts for you, that might be very clear, but it might be a ton of work. So in like our programming world, that comes down to effectively like easy would be more or less like lines of code. Like, can I get the job done in like 3 lines of code? And simple is going to be like, if I actually look into the parts of it, is it going to make sense? Can I pull it apart? Could I just do this thing but not that thing? Can I like dive into the code? You know, sort of like magic would sort of take away from simplicity. And you can kind of see that tension right there, because I just said magic takes away from simplicity, but it adds to the easy. And you don't want to be all the way over to simple, and you don't want to be all the way over to easy. And ideally, in like one of the, if you like Google simple versus easy, like what you're supposed to get to is like do the simple first, because that's actually very difficult. It's very difficult to get all the parts kind of decoupled and built properly, and then put layers on top of it and make it easy. So the reason that I love Symfony is because it is always aimed to accomplish first and foremost the simple part. but maybe at the expense of the easy part. And this was definitely true, especially with early in Symfony. And actually a lot of where like Symfony has its reputation as being like more difficult to learn and big and things like that is because we sort of got the simple right. We sort of got these components because that was the #1 priority with Symfony, was to get these small important components together. And then we built a framework on top of that. And the framework was usable, but things weren't as easy as they should have been. And that's something that we've been fixing kind of like over the years after that. So it's like, we have this great simple base. Let's actually make things easier and make developers more productive, which brings me to why I love Laravel. Now, to be clear, I don't actually use Laravel, but I do love Laravel because I steal from it all the time. What Laravel and what Taylor has done really well is start not with thinking about what do a bunch of little PHP components need to do? What do the input and outputs of the individual pieces need to do? He thought about, if I was going to solve this problem as a developer, what would that? So one perspective is coming from, I'm building the library itself, and the other perspective is from the user. So they're kind of like two totally different perspectives. So Laravel grows out of that, out of like, what would be the, I've even heard Taylor say this, what would be the perfect interface, the perfect 5 lines of code I would want to write to accomplish this task. And then let's see if we can make that happen. Which kind of explains, you see like really kind of crazy things that Taylor has been able to pull off. And I think that sort of explains it. Because he's like, this is what I would want it to do, which maybe other people wouldn't even think of because it seems so off the wall that that would even be possible. But then he worked backwards and was able to connect the dots and make it happen. So I steal from Laravel all the time. In the Symfony world, I'm kind of like Mr. Developer Experience. So I'll go into Laravel and kind of see the things that they're doing and see like innovative ways that made things easy. And then take the Symfony pieces and see if we can basically say, hey, we have those 3 pieces. We just dummies. We just never actually like gave a nice little interface to hook those up to make it easy. We had the simple, we just never got the easy. And of course, I also hate Laravel because and this is like the real dividing line between Symfony and Laravel, and it's not right or wrong. But Laravel introduces the magic. And Symfony doesn't, which makes Laravel easier, and it makes Symfony less easy. But there's also less magic going on behind the scenes. Now, of course, Symfony has its own layer of magic, but there are certain things like the introduction of like flat functions in Laravel, which is not wrong, and actually is very pragmatic. But from the Symfony development philosophy of like object-oriented coding and don't violate object-oriented coding, don't use static context, those types of things, that's something that we would never do, is bring in like flat functions. We would go through and do proper dependency injection and all that. And I'll get into that kind of stuff. But the real point is, and this is actually going to be really cool when we look at some code, Symfony and Laravel, and also Drupal, and also like tons of other projects, but these are like the most important guys because they're the most complete products. They're really all falling fairly close from the same tree. So this is Laravel's composer.json file. And you can see down here, about half of it comes from Symfony components. And I actually included SwiftMiller in there because that's a component that was made by the lead developer of Symfony as well. Also, Monologue, and I think there's one other one, is another thing that was made by Symfony, even though it's not in the Symfony namespace. So basically half of it under the hood is made by Symfony. By the way, I talked about the simple versus easy thing. You want to be simple first and then add the easy layers on top of that. Sometimes in Laravel, it looks to me like it was sort of cut straight to easy, but a lot of Laravel, on the base of Laravel, was actually doing it perfectly. They got the simple, and then he added the easy on top of it. And you'll see this in a second. There are literally, if you dove into Laravel's code, you'll know this. There's literally spots where he's taken a class in Symfony and subclassed it and added like 5 helper methods. Didn't do that anything, but something that maybe took like 4 lines of code before only takes 1 line of code. But really, you're working with the same underlying pieces. So a lot, when you see things like that, it's actually the simple versus easy thing being done really well. Drupal's composer.json, because oh my God, Drupal, the crazy weird CMS, the latest version's built on top of Composer. It has components in it, and actually you can see about 2/3 of it is made from Symfony. There's actually another Symfony one down here somewhere. There it is. Oh, the PSR bridge. Cool. So what I'm going to do is actually build some things in Laravel and build some things in Symfony. Compare them. Talk about what's going on under the surface. This is actually really, really fun for me to make. So downloading a project skeleton. So how do we get a project started in Laravel?
Yes.
Oh, that was okay. There's multiple ways. Composer is one way. How would you do that? How do you do it in Composer? I should walk me through. Do you create a new directory and then Composer require Laravel? Or do you do a Composer create project? Yeah, Composer create project. Yeah, that's number one. Yeah, Composer create project. Or the other way is they have the installer, which is basically kind of a, just kind of goes and gets the same project as create project, which is what this is. So if you have a Laravel installer, Laravel new, and then a directory name. So we're going to create a small project about dinosaurs because that's mostly what I build when I'm doing tutorials. So that's what Laravel looks like. That's what Symfony looks like. Woo! Okay, so the exact same thing. And both of them are just downloading the same, their own project skeleton. So it's the same kind of step to get started. Oh yeah, and this is just like what Symfony's looks like. By the way, that comes from Symfony's console component, which Laravel users are going to recognize because that's the same thing that gives you all of the command line stuff inside of Laravel as well. So that looked really rad to you. You can just go steal that code and put it in your Laravel project the next time, and it's going to work because it's all the same underlying component. So Symfony/console is one of the components that's shared. Actually, one of the best components that's shared. All right, so start the built-in PHP web server. At least this is what I do because I basically. How many people use the built-in PHP web server when they develop?
Early on, usually.
Early on, and what makes you switch later? I'm curious.
Eventually, there just tends to be some sort of customizations I want to do, especially the PHP, where it's just easier to have a separate install of all the modules in the PHP INI file.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's easier to whip up a browser without having to bring that up and start that server.
That's a good one. That's a fair one, yeah. So I don't even think I have Nginx or Apache installed on my computer. I don't think I wouldn't even know. It's been so long. So I just use the built-in PHP web server. I just tell you that because if you don't know about it or you haven't used it much, it's pretty legit. And unless you start doing some customizations or you're like, well, part of my app works because I have this like Nginx, site thing, which like rewrites it in this way. For most apps, you can just spin this up really quickly. By the way, how do you spin up a built-in web server? It's like pop quiz time. What's the command? You're looking like you know it.
It just depends what you're doing. Things like I use Laravel.
Oh, that way. But what's the actual command in PHP?
Oh, it's PHP.
Yep, PHP capital S. So you'll see that if you haven't used it before. PHP space -S space localhost :8000, and boom, you have localhost :8000 serving from that directory. So again, I use it all the time for everything. The only downside is you have to spin it up next time you start start your machine. But if you're somebody working in a company where you have a lot of projects, that can kind of set up time for things. If you have one project you only work on, then might as well get Nginx started for your one project. But both Laravel and Symfony have a way to do this automatically for you. Not that it's a one command either way, but PHP artisan serve, and then Symfony's is bin console server :run. So again, you're all familiar, except for people that maybe have not seen Laravel before. Artisan is the console command that uses Symfony console behind the scenes. Symfony's is called bin/console, and it's the exact same thing, these exact same underlying component library. If you run PHP bin/console, you'll get a list of all the commands exactly like you do in Laravel. So that's kind of a cool thing. It's cool because, one, both libraries didn't need to write that, but also as users, right, we're getting some consistency. I understand how to pass flags into because they're using the exact same things under the surface. And of course, Composer uses that same console thing behind the scenes as well. Cool, so let's actually get to the interesting stuff. Building a page. So building a page, no matter what you're doing, pretty much any web framework is going to be a route and a controller. So a route builds the URL, controller is the function we write that builds the page. That gets a little bit cloudy in CMSs and all that. But route and controller are steps. So Laravel. Oh, and by the way, if you guys don't like some Laravel code that I'm writing up here, you can totally raise your hand and be like, well, you should do it this way. Small enough group here, you can call me out. My Laravel food is in fact, part of the point of this talk is because everyone is these three technologies are so close together, you can kind of step over pretty darn easily. So I have no business writing Laravel code as quickly as I can, but because I come from the Symfony background, I'm like, oh yeah. Well, what's the syntax? Oh yeah, it's just that. But it's all the same stuff behind the scenes. So route get /roar /curly brace length. So there's our wildcard curly brace length right there, and then we're going to set up a controller, dyno controller at roar. Cool. So there's our route, check. Step 2, of course. Now curly brace length in the URL, that's gonna map to a $ length. So if I go to /roar/50, then $ length is going to get passed to there, and they match by name. So I'm just telling people that might not be familiar with that. Cool. And then here's our controller, and I make like this greeting variable here, which is kind of fun because it gets longer if the length is longer. And then I render a template with the view function. Cool. Yeah, and that's it. And then there's the blade template. Cool. All right, so let's see how that looks in Symfony. So remember in Symfony, same thing, route, and then a controller. So this was the controller, obviously. In Symfony, there's multiple ways to do it, but most commonly you're actually going to see the route and the controller put together. This is an idea that almost made it into Laravel, but then didn't make it into Laravel, and a lot of people were angry about it not being in there and angry about it being in there, but that's fine. So one of the ways that you can put routes inside of Symfony is via annotations right here. So it's like literally the @route that's above the function /roar/curly brace length. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But thing is, the point is it's the exact same idea. It's the exact same syntax. You know, so it's still curly brace length. It's not like Symfony. It's not like square bracket length or something like that. And it still maps to a $ length argument to your controller. Why? Because they use the same component behind the scenes anyways. So it all comes back to using Symfony /router component, the small library behind the scenes. Laravel dresses a few things up and changes a few things, but fundamentally, you're boiling down to the same router code that's handling this, which is why, no coincidence, we see the exact same syntax here for getting our route, for doing our route and our wildcard and all that stuff. Down here, basically the same thing. We create that same variable. Then instead of the view function, we call this arrow render. So it's one of the things you'll notice is like, I mean, there's multiple ways to do things in Laravel and Symfony, but where Laravel will have like flat functions like view that does something, Symfony will put those on a base controller method. And again, it's that same thing where you're really doing the same thing. It's just that Symfony decides not to violate and use flat functions. And I use the word violate gently, right? So I'm not saying that that's wrong. And Symfony says, no, we're sticking to object-oriented code. Definitely sticking to it. And so this is the way they do it. They say extend a controller, and that controller is going to give you that, that render function instead of going out to a flat function or a static context or something like that. But basically the same thing. There's our template, and our template looks like this, which is almost exactly alike, except I dropped the $ right there. So blade and twig are sort of cousins in a sense. Cool. So on that kind of like routing thing, oh wait, one other thing I was talking about. Actually, I'll go forward and talk about here. No, it's not. No, there it is. There we go. So like, there's other things with routing, like in Laravel. Well, I only want my route to match a GET request or POST request. So again, like fundamentally, you have the same component behind the scenes, so it's just a matter of a slightly different syntax. This is the way that we do it in annotation routing, @method GET. So when I'm going the other direction, those are the questions I'm asking. It was like, hey, I want to show them how they make a route that matches only GET. So I'm like, how do I do that in Laravel? Oh, that's how you do it. Sweet, got it. Boom, done. On behind the scenes, I know exactly what to expect because it's all the same stuff. And then if you want to make length optional, again, this is like slightly different syntax-wise. So in Laravel, it's like what, like a slash right there?
Question mark.
Question mark, thank you. It's nice to be in a room full of people that are good at a technology that I don't know that well. So question mark right there, and in Symfony, you just like default the argument right there. Now, I mentioned I want to come back to annotation routes. You can do one of the great and therefore also terrible things in Symfony is that you can do everything any way you want. So we're showing annotation routes here. The second most common format is YAML routes. So you'll see that as well. So if you don't want to use annotations, you can always use YAML routes or XML routes, or you can build your routes in PHP as PHP objects, so you can do whatever you want. I like this way, and I help push for this way in Symfony because I like having the context right next to each other. Some people really freak out with annotations, so at least in Symfony we can say, hey, it's okay, it's not being forced on you. Cool. All right, so that kind of handles like the routing controller thing. So let's talk about requests and responses, because after all, like our only job as developers is to understand the incoming request and to return a response. And we want to do that in as little work as possible, and that has nothing to do with framework or even programming language. That's just our fundamental job there. So like something simple like fetching a query parameter. So we have like a question mark page equals 3 on the URL. So 2 things to notice here. So this is the controller again. This is Laravel. So kind of watch my upper right corner there for the logo. So the first thing is you're going to want Laravel's request object. In Laravel, like Symfony, there's multiple ways to do this, but the most common way, or at least seems like the most common way, is you type in an argument with Laravel's request object. So just by the presence of that being there before Laravel calls your controller, it goes, ooh, like, let me check and see if you've typed into the request argument. I'll do a little bit of magic behind the scenes that actually makes sure that I pass that $sign request argument in. Then it's request arrow input, and that makes perfect sense, and it gets that. Input behind the scenes checks to see if it's a GET request or a POST request, and uses that to figure out if you want GET parameters or POST parameters. Cool? There's the Symfony one. See that? Watch this. Ooh, this is like my favorite slide transition of the whole thing. Isn't that crazy? I mean, like I know that they're built on the same foundations, but like that transition when I did the code on this one, I was like, wait a second, that was almost identical. Kind of blew my mind. So literally in Symfony, the way you get the request object is exactly the same. You type in Symfony's request object. So one of the only 2 things that changed up there was the use statement, which is Symfony's request object. And as long as you do that, Symfony passes the request object. Down here, instead of request arrow input, it's request arrow query arrow get. So query meaning obviously like query parameters, like get parameters. So there's other things on here if you want to get like post parameters. It's called request arrow request, because if you read the HTTP spec, apparently post parameters are called request parameters. So request arrow request. Request arrow headers, request arrow cookies, it's all that kind of stuff. Cool? Now watch this. I'm going to flip back. I'm going to go forward, but we're going to flip back to Laravel. Watch this. Boom. Notice this did not change. So it's kind of showing this off here. Laravel's request object extends Symfony's request object and adds a couple of helper methods to it. One of those is that input method. So you can use that input method in Laravel if you want to, and there's certainly no reason not to. Or you can use request arrow query arrow get, because Laravel's request object extends Symfony's request object. And you can type in Symfony's request object. That's not really significant here. It still passes you Laravel's request object. I'm just kind of like highlighting that you're still technically type hinting a request object, so it passes the request object to you behind the scenes. So like this is really cool stuff. It shows like the way controllers work, the way the request object works is identical between the 2, and especially the request and response objects don't differ very much between Symfony and Laravel. So on that, let's get back to the other side of the coin, which is response objects. So by the way, I'm just going to mention this. Well, yeah, I'll mention this. So actually, this is great because you guys can answer it. What types of valid things can you return from a Laravel controller? Like obviously you can return a view object because that's what the view function gives you. It returns a view object. You can also return a response. Can you return text, string?
Yeah, you can echo strings.
Yeah, you can just return foo right here. And just okay, that's what I thought. Okay. So Laravel's controller, you can return a few things that you'd expect to be able to return. So if you return a string like hello world from a controller, it's going to turn into a page that says hello world on it. Ultimately, though, there's still a response object behind the scenes. There has to be a response. Our job is to send back a response, not like 10 characters of text. So something later wraps that in a response, gives it a 200 status code, maybe it attaches a couple sane headers to it, and sends it out the door. Same thing when you use the view function layer, but that turns into a view object that's eventually like rendered and put into a response object. Or you can actually return a legitimate response object. The point is in both frameworks, your job is to create that response object, which is basically content, status code, and headers. Laravel gives you that returns legitimately a response object. So I keep saying response object, Symfony has a response class. So I'm talking about returning that, or a subclass of Symfony's response object. So in this case, return response, that's one of those flat functions, those helper flat functions. Arrow JSON, you pass the data. We can all kind of imagine what goes on behind the scenes there. But this ultimately returns, so I'm going to flip over to the Symfony one, that. So that class comes from Symfony. So this is just a little factory pattern, basically, a little like helper thing. to make it easier for you to return a JSON response. But if you dump that variable, you'd see, oh, this is like a Symfony JSON response.
Factory or facade?
Factory. Yeah, not facade. There's some facade stuff behind there, and I'll talk about facades in a second. But factory is what I meant. So in Symfony, if you want to return a JSON response, this is the way you do it. We just kind of give you that object. So you can kind of see, like, and this is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night as a kind of Symfony core contributor. You can kind of see the difference here between the way Laravel does it and the way Symfony does it. And ours just requires just like a tiny bit more typing because you need the use statement up there. But this one goes out and uses kind of these flat function shortcuts that I don't like having. So it's like one of those things where I go, gosh, it's really like no different, but like this one looks really good, and ours is like longer, but ours makes more sense, but theirs looks cooler, you know, but it's really doing the same thing behind the scenes. So ultimately, JSON response both cases, and I can't remember if JSON response is one. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's right. And to kind of flip back to Laravel here, you watch the use statements when I go from Symfony to Laravel. You can, of course, do the same thing inside of Laravel. Laravel, once again, they subclass the JSON response class, but it's got like 1 or 2 extra functions in it. I think it's got a get data function, so if you like give your JSON response data, you can get it out afterwards. I think that's just like a little extra feature that's added to it. Cool. All right, so this is where things get a little dicey here. Services and the container and all that kind of stuff. Probably the difference between Symfony and Laravel. Probably the one that keeps me up at night the most. So we're going to create a service. By service, I'm talking about a class that has nothing to do with my framework that does some work for me. Voila, service, roar generator, because apparently creating our big long roar string is a ton of work. So we want to organize our code a little bit, so we get that out of our controller and we put it into this class right here. Cool, and you can see there's nothing, I mean, you can't even tell what framework this is in, right? There's no words that say Laravel or Symfony or anything right there. But this is the one that I'm going to use in my Laravel app. Cool, and it's in app services roar generator. Not that's important, but just keeping track of where I put this class. Okay, so now in my controller, I'm going to want to use this service. So the way you do that, of course, there's multiple ways to do it, but they're all doing the same thing behind the scenes, is use the app function and pass it roar generator : class. This is the PHP 5.5 syntax that explodes to the full class name of the class. So if you haven't seen that like thing where you class name : class, it's just a shortcut so that I didn't have to type app/services/roar generator right here. I could just put its use statement and do that. So think of this though, this is a string that you're passing. It's the string class name. Cool. Now behind the scenes, because notice this is not a static function. Behind the scenes, it goes into its container system and actually instantiates that roar generator object and then passes container. On some of you guys, this is going to be things that you already know, but just think of the container. Think of services like a useful object, and the container is like a big array of them. So Laravel has this big array where it's keeping track of all of your useful objects, and you can ask that container for one of those useful objects, and it will create it and give it back to you. Or if it's already created it, then it will just say, I already have one of those, and it'll give it back to you. So if I ran this code twice, I literally had this line here, and then I copy and pasted to the next line, we'd only create a roar generator one time. You can configure it to do some other things, but that's what it's going to do. One of that thing automatically. Cool? So really, in some ways, well, a container system is the importance behind everything, but in some ways, the container system is really underwhelming. Like when I teach people that don't understand what a service container is, sometimes I get bent up on this because they're like, I don't get it. I was like, it just saved my new statement. I was like, yeah, that's it. Like the container's only job is to create is to do the new keyword for you, new roar generator, new this, new that. So anyways, the app goes into the container and does that. So what if, I'm going to stay in Laravel here for a second. What if I need the logger? So Laravel has a logger object. If you get a hold of it, you can log stuff. So that's pretty rad. So again, this is kind of cool because this has nothing to do with any framework. This is just dependency injection to the logger inside of this function. We don't go out and call some magic global function, though you can in Laravel and not Symfony, which has pros and cons. The proper object-oriented way to do it is called dependency injection. Fancy way of saying we create a construct function and force whoever creates this to pass a logger in. We set it on a property, and then 10 milliseconds later when somebody calls roar, this is already populated on there because they had to pass it in to the construct function. Cool? So classic dependency injection pattern. The difference is how the frameworks wire this up for you. So with Laravel, actually, I don't have another slide after this for Laravel because that's it. And this is a little bit awesome and creepy and a little harder to understand and magic and easier. Like I'm going back and forth with all these positive and negative words at the same time. Laravel, especially for the Symfony guys, because this will look a little bit bizarre for you, has auto wiring built in. So basically, going back to this code here, this code still works. But if we as normal developers try to say new roar generator, open parentheses, close parentheses right now, it would fail, right? Because it'd be like missing argument 1 to construct function, right? But this still works behind the scenes because Laravel actually reflection, not inflection, does reflection on the construct function, figures out that there's an argument that it's type hinted with logger interface, looks back into itself to see if there are any objects that have that interface on it, and then uses that and automatically injects it in as a constructor argument. And as you'll see in a second, it's one of like the biggest differences between how Laravel and Symfony does their containers. So in Laravel, you can just add the logger interface, and basically the framework is already trying to figure out if it can pass those arguments to your constructor automatically. And obviously you can see like the benefits of that because that means that things are just kind of really fast to kind of wire things in there. All right, so let's go to the Symfony side of things. This is identical. It's in a slightly different spot in my project, but this is identical. So I'm starting with the roar generator, no logger interface, just a simple roar generator. This is the fundamental difference between the containers inside of Symfony and Laravel, or Drupal and Laravel, because you'll see that later that Drupal uses this same type of a thing. So in Laravel, it's all, you can get more complicated than this, but everything is basically class-based. It basically says like, give me an instance of roar generator, and it just figures out whether or not it has one of those yet and then creates it for you. With Symfony, you're going to manually say what's inside of the container. So like fundamentally, like in Laravel, I couldn't ask you like, hey, what services are available inside of like the Laravel container? Well, like here's this big bag of useful objects, what's in there? Because the answer would be like, well, nothing unless you've asked for it. If you don't ask for it, it won't be there. But if you do eventually ask for it, it might be there. So really, like what's in Laravel's container, it's like anything that you might potentially ask for is inside of Laravel's container. It's kind of this amorphous thing, and it can just kind of bend. And if you add a new class, you can just ask for it from the container, and it'll create it without you having to do anything, wire anything else up. So in Symfony, though, you're going to explicitly say, I have a service, a useful object. I want to give it this nickname, my roar generator, which I'm just making up. And then you have to tell it what the class is for that service. So in Symfony's container, and you'll see this in a second, you're actually going to have a concrete list of services. Like here are the 100 useful objects in your system, and each of those has a nickname, so you can grab them out whenever you want. And then inside of your controller, when you fetch those out, it's not going to be by class name now, it's going to be by that nickname. But then after that, what it's doing behind the scenes to actually instantiate those is fairly similar. Ultimately, it's going to come down to this saying new roar generator, just like Laravel said, new roar generator. But we have the extra step here of kind of giving it that nickname. The advantages of that are obviously clarity. The disadvantages of that are that you had to go to a separate file. You know, so the advantages, the other one is you can like move fast. The advantage of this one, more service, see a file just like this where it's actually explicitly defined. Same thing with Drupal. Like when I hack into Drupal, first thing I do is go and look for one of these files. So, okay, what useful objects does Drupal have? Because they're all kind of like laid out inside of one file, and I can see how they're being created and what's using them, and all that kind of stuff. Cool. So what if I need the logger? So again, same thing here. This is the copy and paste from the earlier thing. Dependency injection is framework agnostic, yay. Then once you add that, you need to go back to your services.yml. And there's two different ways to handle this. Actually, I'm going to do it out of order. First way to handle this is you explicitly tell it your arguments. So this is the way that you're going to see most of the time in Symfony. So we don't, well, you saw a second ago, we do have auto wiring. We don't have auto wiring, which basically means that you explicitly say, I have this class, and here's what I want to pass for the first argument. Here's what I want to pass for the second argument. Here's what I want to pass for the third constructor argument. So here is my arguments key, and I'm saying @logger. Why logger? I'll show you that in a second, because logger is one of the nicknames of one of the services inside of my container. Okay. Now obviously, the disadvantage of this is I had to go into this file and do this. the advantages are that I'm in full control of my arguments. Well, that's not fair. You're in full control of your arguments in Laravel, but it's very explicit how you're in full control of your arguments here. There's no magic going behind the scenes. If you ever get an error where it tried to like create your ROAR generator and it passed the wrong thing for argument 2, guess what? It's your fault. And it's right there. There's no digging for it. Like, you're passing the wrong thing for argument 2 because you're explicitly taking care of it. But we do also have auto wiring. It's a relatively new feature, so if you want to use that, you can. It basically is going to do the exact same thing that Laravel's system does behind the scenes. Laravel's auto wiring has a few more features than Symfony does, at least right now, so that might change in the future. So, but we can auto wire, and then it introspects and does all that kind of good stuff. So if you want to be super lazy or super rad about it, you can do that. That's just like classic Symfony by the that was discussed. Like, we make you opt into it, for better or worse. Like, basically, like, we recognize this is a really magic piece of functionality, so we're not going to give it to you automatically. We're going to say, we're going to be like, no, people are going to like walk down that path of magic. Like, let's let them, but let's not force it on them or not have it be done automatically, because that's just kind of the Symfony philosophy things, trying to stay out of the way. Oh, so I mentioned a second ago, how did I know that this was called logger? So again, going back to the thing of when you explicitly define your services, you kind of know what all of your services are in the container, all of your useful objects. So every time I say service, just think like tool I can use to do stuff. So bin console, that's the artisan command, debug : container, and you can get a giant list of the services. So this is just actually a small part, goes down to the E's, beginning of the E's for Symfony. It's like 200 services out of the box in a Symfony framework. And you can search it as well. So debug : container log, and then you get all the services that have the word log in it. There's one called logger. Okay? So again, it's kind of the same thing ultimately. This is aliased by a nickname. In Laravel, services are aliased by their class name. In Symfony, you have to explicitly do it, which gives you like this transparency. In Laravel, you don't, which lacks transparency, but means that you can create services easier because you didn't have to configure them somewhere. On that topic, facades. This is the right letter to have it. I did it without this at first, and I was like, I want to put this squiggly in here. Pretty sure that's the right one. Okay, facades. So this is another way that you can do logging inside of. And what is this actually doing behind the scenes? Facades people? Boom, there you go. Yeah, it's calling a static method and resolving it out of the container. That's the key thing. It's resolving it out of the container. So it's going out of the container and getting the logger service. So there's like two-part thing, right? /log is a system that aliases that to effectively PSR/logger/logger interface, more or less. So there's a system that basically says when you say /log, it's actually like this class name, and then go find it in the container, and then go call whatever method I'm calling on it non-statically, even though it looks static. That's one of those where you go, like, if you'd show me that code and tell me how that works, I would have been like, that's not possible in PHP. That's actually one of those like crazy things that he was able to pull off. And again, like, Symfony would never do this because it's all static and weird and magic and we hate it, but it's actually kind of a cool thing. And actually, I think this highlights, for people that have used Symfony or Laravel for a bit, I think this highlights right here, like, one of the reasons that we'll choose to never cross in the Symfony world, that Laravel is easier to learn than Symfony. It's because you can do this. So there's kind of a, like with all these frameworks to kind of like develop, especially develop correctly, there's kind of like a certain amount of object-orientedness you'd have. And you kind of need to know how the dependency injection flow works that I showed a second ago. And in Symfony, because we don't violate object-oriented stuff, like if you want the logger inside of your ROAR generator, you have to use dependency injection and pass it in. Whereas Laravel gives you this step in between, which is kind of like, this is sort of like not the right way to do it, but it's fine and it works, and so we'll give that to you. So the fact that Laravel has that middle step, I think it's like one of the reasons that I think it's easier to learn for people. Because I mean, I know that if I wasn't that good at OO, or if I were a younger developer and I was not wrapping my mind around it, when push comes to shove, I can throw that into any file that I want and it'll work. Oh yeah, so just behind the scenes, kind of highlighting that. So you said resolved it from the container, so ultimately this resolves that class from the container. So it shouldn't surprise you, that's what it looks like in Symfony. It's like this arrow container, go out to the container and get the service called logger. So we don't have facades inside of there, so we basically don't have that extra shortcut layer. You just go out to the container and ask for the logger service. Events. So this is kind of interesting one as well. So goal would be to use your imagination, because you'd be like, wait, why would I want to do that? For some reason, you decide that you want to add an extra argument to your controller function, like some value, like you look up the language of the user based off of their accept headers or something, and you want to make a $ locale argument available to every single controller in the system. Okay? So the way you're going to do that in both of them is with events. So in Laravel, this is how you register an event. So you're going to go into your event service provider and override the listen protected property. And basically, this is the name of the event. It's obviously a class. It's the name of the event. And this is going to be in this case, we just have one listener, which is going to be the class that we'll override. Cool? And obviously, how do you know what? This is like anything. Anytime you have an event system, I don't care if you're using Drupal or Symfony or Laravel, you Google it, because there's no way to know what events are being fired until you ask, like, how do I hook into the routing system? And it'll be like, oh, this is the event that you want. So you'll see that in both Symfony and Laravel, kind of like this kind of random class or random string that becomes like the string you need to listen to. So this is what we need to create, the add extra param listener. So we have a public function handle. This is the way it works in Laravel. That route matched object that is passed to you, and that gives you access to some stuff, and life is good. Now behind the scenes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just making an assumption here, but I'm pretty sure that I'm right because this would make sense. Behind the scenes, we have a string class, but really when Laravel goes and like grabs that, it's actually resolving that from the container. So it's not like it's just saying new add extra param listener with no constructor arguments. It's going into the container. It's doing the whole introspection thing that you have there. So that's why I allowed you to put a string here, and it figures out how you want to instantiate that. So I don't have a constructor function here, but if I did, then things would be able to kind of get hooked up. Cool, and boom, there's the extra bit. So you know how to do that in Laravel. Here's how you did it. You can do this in Laravel. Maybe that's obvious to everybody or not. I'm not sure. I would say it was easy for me to figure out. Again, things are close enough together where it's kind of fun. Cool, so now there's $1 extra. All right, so let's see this in Symfony. So in Symfony, you're gonna see very, very similar. I'm gonna do things in a slightly different order. You'll see why in a second, but I'm gonna start with the actual class itself. Looks almost identical. It's a function. Function has a different name. I'm past a different object, of course. But the whole idea of event listeners is exactly the same. I'm going to hook into some event. It's going to call some function. And when it calls that function, it's going to pass me some event object. Which event object? Well, depends on what you're listening to. You listen to this event, you're going to get this object. If you're listening to this other event, you'll get this other object. And then this part's different. This is kind of like low-level Symfony stuff, but this is how you add an extra argument to a Symfony controller. Okay? So this is actually the least interesting part here. Now, everything inside of Symfony is going to come back to registering it as a service. So anytime you're basically doing something with a class, we're going to say, great, now you have your class, your event listener, your whatever, registered as a service. So this is back in the services file. I give it a nickname. The nickname does not matter at all. That's just what you'll call it later. Give it the class. And then instead of having like a protected property on top of a class somewhere that says like this event is this, we do it right next to our service definition right here. So this is based, and this says I listen on kernel.request. And that's that random string I was talking about earlier where you wouldn't know what string to put there until you Googled, I'm trying to do X, what listener is kind of there, right? So in Laravel, if you had a class that's an event listener, you'd create that class and then go kind of put a string somewhere that said this is an event listener for, I can't even think what else, but if that class weren't an event listener, but it were something else that's core to Laravel, you would go put its class name somewhere else. Symfony is the same idea, but we're going to do it all in the service registration. So you'll create the class, and then you'll always go to the same spot, the service registration. The difference is going to be what tag you use. So for example, if you want to add, let's see if this is the best example, the Symfony's templating system is called Twig. It's kind of cute. And if you want to like add your own custom functions or filter, if you want to like extend Twig, basically it's called a Twig extension. Create a class. It's got to like implement some interface or something. Do all your code in it, just like we did all of our code right here. And then ultimately, the way you hook that into the system is not by going to some class somewhere and overriding a protected property. I don't mean to make that sound like it's wrong. I'm just drawing a comparison. You go back to where you always go. You go back to the service definition in that case. And what's different there is the tag, instead of being called kernel.eventListener, instead of saying that this service is an event listener, it's called twig.extension. It's Symfony's way of saying that this service is a twig extension. So Symfony, I want you to like use it as such when you boot up the system. And then ultimately you have the exact same result. So events also, like there's different libraries, and actually I'm gonna say this right here. There's different libraries behind the event system, but ultimately, fortunately, they're doing all the exact same thing. It's calling a function, it's passing an event object. There's just a slightly different way to register into that event system. So, like other things that are like the same between Symfony and Laravel, and some of these I want to highlight because you might not even know they exist, and they're pretty awesome. Obviously, I've mentioned the Symfony console a bunch of times because it's one of the best PHP libraries out there. How many people have used the dump function? You know, 1, 1.5, 1 3/4, 2 3/4. Good. This is included in Laravel. It gives you, I spent this entire time saying how it's against Symfony's philosophy to give you any flat functions. This library gives you a flat function called dump. And it's pretty awesome. So literally dump. So instead of using bar dump, you'd use dump. It's meant for debugging. It's really rad. It like dumps out objects and you dumps them out like with JavaScript, so you can like have, you know, you can expand them and stuff like that. It doesn't barf if it has a recursive dependency on something. So it's really, really awesome. And if you dump things out and you end up running like an artisan command, it actually detects you're in the CLI and then dumps it out with colors for your CLI instead of dumping out like HTML, the same HTML that it uses on the browser for that. So that's really rad. Symfony Finder. Does anybody use Symfony Finder? What's Symfony Finder do? You are a man of many tricks.
Yeah. Symfony Finder is a great.
Is it? Yeah, yeah. That was the key. That was the key I was waiting for. Find yeah. I see what you said. You said great file library. I was waiting for the word find, but I guess the word find is right there. Yeah. So it's for finding files. So you can do things like, I need to find all files in this directory, maximum 3 levels deep, that match star.php and were modified within the last 12 hours. And it just gives you back an iterator. And it can also supports streams. So you could actually, there's actually, if you Google for it, there's a famous example with this. If you have files in S3, now don't do this too many files because you are going over network, so it's not that performant. But you can actually do like wrap your S3 in a stream wrapper, and then you can pass that to Finder. And there's actually an example online where you're basically going out to your S3 bucket, asking those exact same questions, and it's returning you an iterator of those files. So it's like one of those things where you don't need it that often, but when you do, like, it's just awesome. Symfony process, I use this for random reasons like 400 times a day. If you're doing any like shell exec kind of stuff, use the process components. You can create processes, you can stop processes, you can run processes asynchronously, you can send signals to processes, you can get their output, error output, exit code, all the stuff that's possible in PHP, but it's these terrible proc underscore functions that nobody knows how to use. So they're all in that. Symfony translation, I just mentioned that because basically Laravel's translator system is built on top of that. And Swift Mailer is another one that comes from the Symfony world that you guys may have used. But we're talking about like the container. Ultimately, I want to spend time on that because that's like probably the most fascinating one. That's different, but ultimately it's the same. One's key-based, one's class-based. They are different libraries, but they're both accomplishing the same thing. They have their pros and cons. Ben sort of talked about that. Authentication I bring up because I talked about like I love Laravel in the beginning and I like stealing from it. So this is one that I specifically stole from Laravel. So Symfony 2.8 has a new authentication component called Guard. You might be familiar with the name from Laravel. Also, Symfony 1 had a guard, so I just thought it was a perfect name to call it Guard, kind of a nod to Laravel and a nod to Symfony 1. So that was one of those cases where Symfony's security component is like notoriously complex. And what happened was, actually for the Java guy back there, I don't know if you've ever used Spring or not. You mentioned Java earlier, yeah. So Symfony's security component is basically a port of Java's Spring's security components. And we had all the pieces sitting there, but you had to wire like 6 classes together to get a custom authentication system going. So like inspired by the way Laravel's Guard worked, and actually a Laravel user helped me do this, we basically brought that over to Symfony. So authentication in Symfony is like super duper awesome rad in Symfony 2.8 because we kind of stole that idea of a single class from Laravel. The interfaces themselves, the way they work, are totally different, but still got it from them. Mini framework. So the mini framework inside of Laravel is Lumen. We have something called the microkernel traits, which is basically, again, it's like the same idea, kind of done sort of differently. Microkernel trait can make your, not that you should do this, but you can actually boot up a full stack framework in one file. So it's kind of like a true micro framework like Silex or something like that, where you can actually say like, I want to create a framework. Composer requires Symfony/Symfony, and then like open up one file and just start like banging out code. But you actually have the Symfony full stack framework behind you. And then of course you can grow into a directory structure as and if you want to. Templating, Twig versus Blade. Boy, I wish Laravel used Twig. I wish that was one that we had in common. I mean, they're close enough, but I can't use Blade very well.
I just use both in my project where we're like super extending WordPress.
Yeah.
And then I'm like building an API that we're like facing with. And it's really funny. There's like a lot of times in Blade that I'm really on Twig. There's times in Twig that I'm really on Blade. Like using them side by side.
That's yeah, you have an interesting perspective then.
Like, sometimes it'd be nice to have the other.
Yeah, I wish there was. That's one of those where like, you know, one of the biggest things about this is the fact that there's standardization. So like, we could have had a similar talk. If I'd given this talk like 5 years ago, it would have basically probably been, maybe let's go longer, like 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It basically would have been probably like a Symfony guy talking to like a Zen framework room, because that would have been like the other framework that was popular in the US at the time. And we would have nothing in common, right? So that's like one of the cool things about this. Like, I just love the standardization for all the reasons that I've said together. So that's just one of them. I was like, I wish it was just standardized. There were like pros and cons of both, probably. And this is interesting. This is probably the biggest difference between Laravel and Symfony. And Symfony doesn't come with a database layer. It's just not a problem that Symfony solves. But of course, Symfony like comes with a way to put Doctrine into it easily. So Doctrine versus Eloquent. Doctrine is not actually part of Symfony, but Doctrine and Eloquent are very, very different. So I think that's honestly, like, as a Symfony core developer, like looking at like usability, looking at like where beginners struggle and stuff, probably like a lot of work can be done on Doctrine to like make it more user friendly. Again, it all comes back. It's classic. It all comes back to like the object oriented side of things. Like, this is Eloquent's active record, which violates object-oriented practice. Nice way, not that I mean it, but something that we wouldn't do in Symfony world. So you use Doctrine. It has its own cons. Like, there's no magic, but then, you know, you have to do a little bit more work. So I just want to bring that up. So if you do use Symfony, you don't actually need a database. You can bring your own database. You can use PDO. You can use Doctrine, DBAL, which is used a little bit in Laravel also. And the backwards compatibility promise is something that's kind of similar but also different. So that's just like something I highlight. Like, one of the biggest advantages of using Symfony, if you do ever use it in a project, is we don't actually break on upgrades, which takes a tremendous amount of work in core to do that. So if I had a Symfony 2.3 project, I could upgrade it to 2.8 and probably just deploy it. Occasionally, some stuff slips through. Usually that stuff we catch. So like when 2.7.0 came out, we caught something that we actually broke backwards compatibility on accident, and it was fixed by 2.7.1, like a week and a half later. So like, this is one of the biggest things. We follow SymVer, so 2.3 to 2.8, you won't break. And I actually have a whole different presentation on this. I hope it's something that the PHP community will do as a whole. Symfony's spent a lot of work pioneering this methodology. But when you do go from 2.3 to 2.4, instead of us changing functionality, we just deprecate it, which is a word that we're all familiar with. People, you know, libraries say they're deprecating things, but Symfony does it religiously. So like, from 2.3 to 2.8, you cannot change something. You can only deprecate it. Like, you cannot break backwards compatibility in any way. When you deprecate it, we trigger a notice that's type E user deprecated. So behind the scenes, you actually go and see a function. Let's say we decide to rename a function. If you look at that old function, it still exists, but it triggers this notice and then calls the new function. And then behind the scenes, Symfony collects all of these. And when you're in the development environment, you can actually see at the bottom of the page, we have the thing called the Web Debug Toolbar. It's this awesome thing at the bottom. I'll show in a second. It'll actually tell you that on this page load, you triggered 23 deprecated calls. And then you can actually click that, and it will tell you exactly what deprecated calls you hit. So the idea is when you upgrade to 2.8, which is the last in the 2 series, all you need to do is basically get rid of your deprecated calls and then switch to using Symfony 3, and it'll work. The difference between Symfony 2.8 and Symfony 3, or 3.4 and 4, when that comes out in like 3 years, is that 2.8 and 3, we basically just removed the deprecated paths. So 2.8 and 3 came out at the exact same moment, just without the deprecated paths. And we did that so that you're not like ever like missing a feature or something. Like, it's the only way to do it if you want to truly have an upgrade path. Because if 2.8 and 3 were 2 different things, well, guess what we would do? Like, if 2.8 came out like 6 months ago and 3.0 came out tomorrow, then guess what we would do in 3.0 over those 6 months? We would like add new features and like deprecate or like change functionality and that kind of stuff. There wouldn't be a clear upgrade path. You'd get 2.8 already with no backwards compatibility, no deprecation notices anymore. And all of a sudden you upgrade to 3 and they'd be like, sorry, we changed other stuff too. So we broke your app. So anyways, it's something that I've given entire presentations on, other people have. It's probably like one of the biggest things that Symfony sent behind the scenes. And it's just like super not sexy, but it's like a massive infrastructure to like make all this stuff work. When pull requests go on a Symfony, they're obviously, but they're also tested against like every PHP version, and the components are tested against every version of each other. So if Symfony Finder says that it requires Symfony console at versions 2.1 to 3.3, it'll actually test it against the console at 2.1 and 3.3 to make sure that we haven't violated that in some way. We haven't like forgotten that, you know, there's some old functionality that we're relying on or something like that. So BC Promise is a huge one. We also have releases that come every 6 months. Super boring stuff. Like I love it, but like super boring. So releases in Symfony are every 6 months. Whatever we get done in those 6 months is what gets released. So we don't like hold anybody up. You know exactly when our long-term, we know exactly like 3.4 will be released in November of 2017 and we'll have long-term support for 3 years. 4.4 will have long-term support, be released in November of 2020. All the things in between there. So like it's all just meant to be like no surprises behind the scenes. And part of the reason is because other projects rely on Symfony. So if we go all cowboy, then like Taylor Otwell's gonna come over to some Symfony guy's house and like break his leg, right? Because it's gonna make his life hell. Okay, almost done here. So Web Debug Toolbar, that's the one thing I just want to show. If you haven't used Symfony before, this is a little guy that shows up at the bottom of your pages. It's got all kinds of massive debug information, what route was done, who we logged in as, how fast did the page go. So it's just like one of the killer features of Symfony. And then if you click any of those links below, you go into the profiler, which has like 100 times more information, including what you're seeing here, which is part of, it goes further down, the timelines. This is actually what happened between the request and response in Symfony. It shows you, actually breaks down. This is meant for like performance, obviously, but it's also like, honestly, it's even better for figuring out like what's going on in your app. Like what kind of magic is running before my controller runs that's like doing something weird. Well, you'll see evidence of that in here, and then you can kind of go dig into it. And there's tons of other stuff inside of here. This, by the way, and this is something that I think a lot of Symfony users don't realize, this also works in the API when you're building an API. And so what I mean is like normally like Symfony developers, they like load their HTML page and then they get this cute Web Debug Toolbar on the bottom and they click that and they go to this, right? So like what happens in an API? Like API, we're not, if you return JSON, we're not like injecting a Web Debug Toolbar on the bottom, right? So, oh, I guess in the API there's no information. Behind the scenes, Symfony is still collecting that information. You just have to go to a URL and find it. So in development mode, if you go to like localhost/_profiler, it'll give you a list of the last 10 requests that went into your Symfony app. So you'll just refresh that page and be like, oh yeah, there's my call right there on top that I get into it, and you get the full profiler for your API endpoint. So you can get all this kind of stuff in your API endpoint. And if you use the dump function on an API endpoint, it actually ends up in one of these tabs. So you can use the dump function and go see your dump variable on the API. Or click the exception tab here, and you'll see the full, beautiful HTML exception page that you didn't want to read in your terminal because you had an error and it barfed out on white text on black screen. So I've talked about Symfony a ton. I've talked about Laravel a ton. Drupal 8, this is going to be really short because Drupal 8 shares a lot with Symfony. In fact, Drupal 8 shares more with Symfony than Laravel shares with Symfony. Specifically, this guy right here, Symfony/dependency injection. That's the container system. So that was one of the biggest differences we want to. Drupal's container system is Symfony's container system. Also, event dispatcher. The events are the same. So if we are going to build basically that same page inside of Drupal, this is where things get really fun because as a custom developer, I have no business doing things in Drupal at all. It's a CMS, right? It's a CMS that a lot of people like complain about and stuff like that. I can go into Drupal 8 and it makes sense to me. I've given a Drupal 8 training. I've never even built a Drupal site before. And I've given a training on it because like things are similar enough. So then here they actually use the YAML routing by default. So you can see it's slightly different annotation, but the key thing is you have the path right here. You all recognize that looks exactly like before. underscore controller thing to specify your full controller function. Cool. And then the controller looks exactly the same, so I can even skip past. I mean, that's literally copy and paste from Symfony, or you can copy and paste that into Laravel, right? Because that returns a response object, which Laravel's one of the things you can return from a Laravel controller. So Drupal 8 and Symfony. So I'm going to talk about Drupal 8 so shortly because it's basically Symfony, minus, if you're familiar with Symfony, the bundle system. It's the only thing that Drupal doesn't have. Request and response objects, yes. The route controller response flow, yes. The event listener system, service container system, the ability to list all of your services is in Drupal 8. Listing all of your routes, that's something that Laravel has as well. That's really handy. Has it. Web debug toolbar. Just kidding, that's in Drupal too. So they have that as well, and it's really awesome. And if you want to are hacking into Drupal 8 for some project, it's not there by default. It's a module that you install, but holy cow! As far as being back-endy kind of developers, being able to see that timeline thing in Drupal 8 and figure out what's going on, because we all think right as far as what controller is being rendered, what event listeners are being done, right? So it shows you all that, and you can just start ripping things open and seeing how things work behind the scenes. So what I'm trying to say is we're all brethren. We all eat pizza together now, which I think is really, really cool. And Symfony is kind of at the base of this whole PHP world. Kind of like I said towards the end, is we kind of factor quality first and the magic second, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. And we do really boring things like don't break backwards compatibility, which is cool, but not that sexy. And predictable release and LTS, as I mentioned before. And kind of simplicity over easy, first and foremost. And really, this is the whole reason that I wanted to come here, is be if you know Symfony, then you're already dangerous and use a whole bunch of projects. And really, more importantly for you guys know Laravel. So if there's some Symfony project that's near you or you might want to bid on or something, dude, go. It's not that big of a deal. You already got it down. The whole object-oriented route controller response event system dependency injection, that's what makes these frameworks hard. They just implement that in a different way. And as long as you guys have your minds wrapped around that kind of stuff, then it's just a matter of finding the syntax. Same thing, crazy enough, with Drupal 8. So watch the Drupal version before you sign up for that project. Drupal 8, same thing. It's still going to be a CMS project, which CMSs are more, they're complex. But yeah, I mean, if you've never used Drupal before, you can dive into it, which is pretty rad. That's it. So thank you guys very much. And we have a plug in there. If you guys do ever want to start with Symfony, we just released our first Symfony 3 screencast. Symfony 3 came out a month ago, and that one's totally free and will be forever, so you can check that out. Any questions or insights? Yep.
What's the penetration level of Drupal, Symfony, Laravel, PHP land?
Good question. So it depends on which continent you're talking about. And so I know about Europe and I know about the US. So in US, as far as custom development frameworks, so not talking about CMS land, Laravel is #1 in the US, probably by a decent margin. And then, well, I don't know about that. Basically in the US, we kind of, we use everything in the US. And so instead of there being a clear leader in the PHP world, every framework has a big base. But Laravel would be the most popular one. And then after that, you probably have Symfony, and probably mixed also with other ones like Yi and Cake PHP. So I think Laravel's a step ahead though, and then everyone else is kind of a little bit behind, but they're all kind of the same level. In Europe, Symfony rules, and Laravel's also popular as well, but Symfony by far is the leader in the custom development world. And as far as Drupal goes, Drupal and Joomla would be the #1 CMSs in PHP, not counting WordPress. So we all know WordPress runs 40% of the web or something like that. So Drupal runs about 4% of the web, I think, somewhere in that. It's low single digits, so it's significant. And so that would make probably if Drupal runs 4% of the web, then Symfony and Laravel probably run 0.5% of the web or something like that. Which sounds small, but considering how many different languages there are and how many different sites are out there written in flat PHP or were developed 10 years ago, is really large. I mean, Drupal, right? So Drupal is runs whitehouse.gov. Drupal's huge. So the fact that I say Drupal only runs 4% of the web sounds kind of small, but it's actually really significant. Did that answer your question? Sure. Other questions, insights, complaints? want to afterwards. More than happy to. You guys can sharpen out my Laravel foo. I think we have probably more pizza, right?
Yeah, there's like half the pizza left. So please eat pizza. There's pop. We have this room for a little bit longer. I don't know.
Sure.
And I don't know if anyone wants to go to a bar or something afterwards, but I don't know. You're gonna hang around for a bit or not?
Yeah, yeah. It depends on time. Yeah, hang out for a bit. Yeah, love that.
Where are you gonna go for beer?
What's around here? Norm?
Where are you guys from?
I'm new in town. Getting food tickets
I only know I'm
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm born.
Thanks for streaming this too.
Oh yeah, yeah. I should probably stop that now.